Secretary Kwarteng, it's a pleasure to have you with us at the ARPA-E Summit.
Really good to be here.
I'm going to keep my opening comments very short. First, I'd like to just explore UK leadership on the climate side, if I could.
Sure.
First, with a question on the domestic side. Having worked both on the domestic and international side, as both of us have over the years, any credibility on the international side, of course, starts with what you're doing at home. Are you walking the talk? And I think a lot of us have been incredibly impressed with the domestic target that you all have set, the 78% target by 2035 in terms of reductions. And I'd love to ask you how you came about that target, how you built the political support for that target, in particular interest in your climate change committee and what process and role did that play?
So this story didn't start just a few weeks ago. As you know, obviously the carbon reduction target is from 1990. But even in 2008, we passed a very important piece of legislation in the House of Commons, which was all about the reduction, the 80% reduction of carbon emissions by 2050. That was the initial target. And what was striking about that, I mean, this was before I was even elected to the House of Commons, so it was 13 years ago. But what was striking about it, even then in 2008, there was quite a large measure of cross-party support. The then Labour government introduced the legislation. The Conservative opposition essentially supported it. I think only 3 or 4 MPs, Conservative MPs, voted against it. So right from the start, I think in the UK, we've had a cross-party or a wider measure of cross-party consensus than you've probably had in other countries, other advanced economies. And then, of course, in 2019, just a month before I was made Minister of State for Energy, the Energy Minister, we passed the net zero 2050 target. And again, when you saw the debate in the Houses of Parliament, in the House of Commons, there was quite a large measure of cross-party support. So in terms of the decarbonisation agenda, the fight against climate change, we've been lucky that the vision hasn't really split along partisan lines. And so the 78% target really flows from a long period of cross-party agreement about this issue. And as of today, we've already reduced from 1990 levels by 45%. So I always say to people that, you know, in many ways, we're in the middle of the journey. There's still a hell of a long way to go, no doubt. But the 78% target refers or can only be made possible by what we've done so far. And so far, we've reduced 45%. A lot of that is low-hanging fruit. A lot of that is probably less challenging than the next phase of this journey. But I always stress it's not something that came out of a clear blue sky. So cross-party agreement and the fact that we've done quite a bit along the route set the target, the ambitious target, framed the ambitious target that we set.
Well, thanks for that, Secretary. And as you said, even with all the progress that you've made, and I think your emissions are down to the levels they were in the UK in the 1880s or something along those lines. Very, very impressive. And I have to say, for those who are looking at apples to apples comparisons in terms of national country targets, I don't think you can get more impressive than what the UK has put on the table, at least by the analysis that I've seen. But you mentioned a long way to go. There is a long way to go. There's hard to decarbonize sectors. There's technologies that aren't there yet at commercial scale. So I'd love to ask you a few questions on those technologies.
Definitely.
One area, if I could start, is offshore wind. Again, the UK has been a leader in offshore wind for many years. Would love to hear how you got there on offshore wind. Any advice, certainly for us in the US, as we're getting started on that journey as well.
So what I would say on that is that offshore wind, in terms of the energy piece across the UK, offshore wind has really been the outstanding success story over the last 10 years. And there are two things I would say about that. I mean, the statistic that jumps out at me when I read these things and look at the progress that has been made are, firstly, that in 2012, which wasn't that long ago, it's 9 years ago, 2012, 40% of the electricity that was generated in the UK came from coal. Today, that's 2%. And really, the reason why that has collapsed or gone down so considerably is because of the success of offshore wind. Now, in terms of offshore wind, what has really worked for us is not simply the government writing checks and investing in it directly. What we did was we constructed a framework that was investable. So we had the government supported the price or supported auctions and we allowed private operators to bid in an auction process, essentially to make offshore wind, and they would win a contract on that basis. It's like a form of tender, but it's an auction, a CFD, contract for difference auction, we call it, contract for difference. So that has essentially given us a mechanism whereby the government does provide some support, but the vast majority of the investment, something like 94 billion in the last 10 years in offshore wind, 2/3 of that or more has come from the private sector. And I think that we've learned a huge amount from that, because we've learned that the only way to get to net zero is by involving private capital as well as state investment. And I think that insight is critically important for net zero. If you rely on the government to do it all, I don't think you'll get there. Similarly, if you rely on the private sector to get there exclusively, I think it'll be very challenging. It has to be a mix of a dialogue, if you like, between the two. And that's worked very well for the UK.
Well, thanks for the lesson in terms of the progress that you've seen in offshore wind. It has been impressive. The potential for offshore wind is even more enormous than the UK has taken advantage of and others. The statistic that comes to mind from my old employer, the International Energy Agency, was you have 18 times the amount of potential electricity in offshore wind than we currently use today throughout the world. So 18, it's a huge, it's an immense resource. And one of the key technologies I know you're focused on in the UK, we're focused on here, not only within DOE and the US government, but in ARPA-E in particular, is floating offshore wind.
Yeah.
And I think we even have some partnership together between our two countries in that area. Love to hear how you think about offshore wind, where you see the potential for that, what more we need to be doing. And of course, you mentioned not only the importance of the private sector side, but the government side as well, to do the kinds of investments to get those price points where they need to. So any thoughts on floating offshore wind?
Yeah, floating offshore wind, I think, is the next frontier in terms of offshore wind. And it's something that the Prime Minister and I are very focused on. He talks about his 10-point plan, which was announced in November last year, only 6 months ago. And the first point of that was all about offshore wind. And within the offshore wind offer, we've committed ourselves to 1 gigawatt of floating offshore wind capacity by 2030. And that's been a very clear signal to market operators and also to investors that we mean business in this technology. And again, as you say, David, I think that we have a real opportunity here. Because of, if you look at wind, I mean, it's everywhere. It's everywhere, somewhere around the world. The wind is blowing. It's a natural energy that we are only really at the beginning of harnessing. And I think floating offshore wind will be part of that story, and it'll be very successful.
Let me ask you a more open-ended question on the innovation side. I'm sure our colleagues here are very curious to hear what technologies you're particularly excited about going forward in terms of innovation. You've got a new advanced research investment agency similar to ARPA-E that you're looking to set up in the UK. You've got a £1 billion commitment investment to really double your game on the innovation side of things. Any other technologies you're particularly excited about as we go forward?
Yeah, there are a huge range of things that are very exciting. I mean, you mentioned hydrogen. Hydrogen, we're coming out with a hydrogen strategy in the department in the next 2 months. And I think the UK is going to be a real pioneer in this, because we're interested in both green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. I read, as energy minister, I read the EU hydrogen strategy and the German hydrogen strategy, and their focus was almost exclusively on electrolyzer produced hydrogen, so-called green hydrogen. We think there's a real opportunity for blue hydrogen, which is formed through methane reformation and carbon capture. And I think the production of blue hydrogen, the rollout of carbon capture, which is another technology that a new technology that we're focusing on trying to see innovation in, are going to be critically important. And alongside things like, as we've mentioned, floating offshore wind, we haven't mentioned SMRs, small modular reactors in the nuclear space. I think we're really opening up a world where we can have huge amounts of power in a decarbonized way. And I think, rolling the clock forward, we'll look back in amazement that we were we were burning, hydrocarbons for so long. Future generations will marvel at that.
Well, couldn't agree more with you on the hydrogen side of things. Exciting opportunities using existing industrial clusters to really get the hydrogen, the clean hydrogen economy up and running. Secretary Granholm and I just had extensive conversations about this last week, and we'll certainly be there with you and with others working on the hydrogen side. I know we're just about out of time. Maybe one last question for you, if I could. We talked about the domestic leadership, and of course, I think everyone's looking to the UK for international leadership. And congratulations for last week's G7 meeting among energy and environment and climate ministers. Very impressive outcome, especially the communique, but the level of discussion as well, having participated in some of those discussions. You are heading up mission innovation. You're, of course, the COP26 presidency, et cetera. Love to have any thoughts from your end on what do we need from the international side of things and what makes good international collaboration, either bilaterally or multilaterally. What are
I think you need both. I think you need to have strong bilateral relations, as we've cultivated certainly with the US in the past. We're delighted that the US is perhaps even more aligned with us on climate change than in the previous administration. I had very good relations with Dan Brouillette and others. But we weren't exactly seeing eye to eye on climate change, and it's great to see the renewed commitment of the United States through President Biden and Secretary Granholm as well. I think it's really, really encouraging, and I think so. Those bilateral relationships are really important, and I think they really form the basis of really successful multilateral engagement. So, as Energy Minister and now as Secretary. Energy Secretary, I've always worked very well with Canadian counterparts, with American, US counterparts, now closely with Japanese, French counterparts. And I think those relationships are really important. In terms of and as you say, last week was a really striking occasion where we got absolute unity on what was quite an ambitious policy program, and all the G7 came round behind the communique, and that's really, really impressive. I think my colleague and former boss, Alok Sharma, is doing a great job actually as an international diplomat, and we're looking forward to great things later this year at COP26.
Well, thank you very much, Secretary, not only for being with us today at the ARPA-E Summit, but more importantly for all your phenomenal leadership domestically and walking the talk and implementing and achieving those reduction targets, and your leadership internationally. It's terrific to not only have such a bilateral partner in the UK, but also leading the world, helping to lead the world, trying to get us all going in the direction at the pace and scale that we need to. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. Thank you. See you soon.
Thank you.
Very nice to see you. Take care.
Nice to see you as well.
Bye.